The reaction across Europe did not slow down after that speech in Rome, because the political shockwave continued spreading through every major capital on the continent. Leaders who had once treated the debate over European authority as a technical discussion suddenly found themselves responding to public pressure that was growing louder every day. For decades, the European Union had built its legitimacy on the promise of stability, economic growth, and shared prosperity. Many citizens accepted the complexity of European institutions because they believed the system ultimately served their interests. But the events unfolding across the continent were beginning to challenge that assumption. In the weeks following Meloni's speech, newspapers, television networks, and online platforms across Europe began revisiting a question that had rarely been discussed openly before. How much power had gradually moved from national governments to centralized European institutions? And when exactly had that shift happened? Historians pointed out that the European project had always been designed as a balance between cooperation and sovereignty. The original treaties that created the community after the Second World War focused primarily on economic coordination between independent nations. Over time, however, the structure expanded through additional treaties, regulatory frameworks, and policy mechanisms that gradually increased the authority of supranational institutions. Each step had been justified by practical needs: coordinating trade, regulating markets, managing borders, and responding to crises. But taken together, these changes had created a system where many important decisions affecting citizens were made far from national parliaments. For years, this gradual shift occurred without major public resistance because the benefits of integration seemed obvious. The single market allowed businesses to trade across borders more easily. Common regulatory standards simplified economic cooperation. Shared policies helped smaller countries gain influence in global negotiations. Yet, as economic pressures increased across Europe, many voters began reconsidering the balance between national control and centralized governance. Energy shortages, inflation, and migration pressures were affecting daily life in ways that made institutional debates feel suddenly personal. Citizens who had rarely paid attention to European policy began asking how decisions about energy supply, migration quotas, or environmental regulations were actually made. Governments across Europe were forced to respond to these questions. Some leaders defended the existing system, arguing that deeper integration was necessary in a world dominated by powerful global actors. They warned that weakening European institutions could leave individual countries isolated and vulnerable. Others cautiously acknowledged that reforms might be necessary to restore public confidence. The situation became even more complicated when additional political tensions appeared across the continent. Elections in several European countries revealed growing support for parties that criticized centralized authority and called for stronger national sovereignty. These movements varied widely in ideology, but they shared one common theme. Many voters believed that the relationship between national governments and European institutions needed to be renegotiated. Inside Brussels, officials were aware of these developments and began launching a coordinated communication effort designed to emphasize the achievements of European cooperation. Reports highlighted successful joint initiatives, including economic recovery funds, scientific research programs, and cross-border infrastructure investments. Officials argued that these accomplishments demonstrated the practical benefits of collective decision-making. But critics responded that economic achievements did not eliminate the need for democratic accountability. They insisted that institutions managing such large resources must operate with greater transparency and clearer limits on authority. The debate intensified when analysts began examining the financial tools available to European institutions. One of the most powerful mechanisms within the EU structure involves the distribution of development funds to member states. These funds support infrastructure modernization, regional development, and economic recovery programs across the continent. Because the sums involved are enormous, the conditions attached to these funds can influence political decisions within member states. Supporters argue that these conditions ensure responsible governance and adherence to shared legal standards. Critics counter that the same mechanisms could be interpreted as political leverage if used selectively. Meloni understood that this financial dimension lay at the heart of the growing controversy. During her meetings with European leaders, she had observed how economic incentives and regulatory frameworks could shape political outcomes without requiring open confrontation. This observation reinforced her belief that the future of European integration would depend on clarifying the boundaries between cooperation and coercion. As public debate intensified, she continued presenting her proposals as an attempt to strengthen rather than weaken the European project. She argued that transparency and clearly defined authority would ultimately reinforce the legitimacy of European institutions. According to her reasoning, citizens were more likely to support cooperation if they believed that national democratic mandates remained respected within the broader system. This argument resonated with many observers, who feared that ignoring public concerns could create deeper political divisions across Europe. Friendly, political analysts began describing the situation as Europe's constitutional moment. Although no formal constitutional convention had been called, the scale of the debate resembled the discussions that shaped earlier stages of European integration. Questions about sovereignty, legitimacy, and institutional authority were once again being examined at the highest levels of political discourse. Governments organized internal reviews of treaty provisions. Legal experts published detailed analyses. Think tanks across Europe proposed alternative models for balancing national autonomy with collective action. Some suggested a looser confederation of sovereign states cooperating on specific policy areas, while others argued that the existing system simply needed procedural reforms rather than structural change. Through all of this, Meloni maintained a consistent strategy. She avoided inflammatory rhetoric and continued framing her arguments as part of a broader conversation about democratic accountability. Her speeches emphasized that cooperation between nations remained essential in an interconnected world, but insisted that cooperation must remain voluntary and transparent. This careful positioning allowed her message to reach audiences beyond Italy, because many citizens across Europe shared similar concerns, even if their governments did not publicly endorse them. As months passed, the political atmosphere across the continent continued evolving. The initial controversy that began with a single speech had transformed into a much larger discussion about the direction of European governance. Conferences, debates, and policy forums explored potential reforms ranging from enhanced parliamentary oversight to clearer divisions of authority between national and European institutions. Regardless of the specific proposals, one conclusion had become unavoidable. The political silence that once surrounded the architecture of European power had ended. Citizens were now actively engaged in discussions about sovereignty, integration, and democratic legitimacy. Whether these debates would ultimately strengthen the European Union by encouraging reform, or weaken it by exposing deeper divisions, remained uncertain. But the era when institutional authority could operate without widespread public scrutiny had clearly passed. Europe was entering a new phase of its political evolution, where the relationship between national identity and continental cooperation would be renegotiated in full view of its